Hello, welcome to another episode of Spart Talk. My name is Vincent David, and I know you are used to having Mansa as your host, but today you're stuck with me because Mansa is actually in the seat of the interviewee. Hello, Mansa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And today you're the perfect guest to try to dive into the whole conflict we've been witnessing since late April between India and Pakistan. For those I presume a lot of our listeners are aware of what's been going on. Late April, there was an attack against Indian tourists carried out by the Resistance Front, Kashmiri separatist group. So in Kashmir, in Pahalgam, India responded accusing Pakistan of supporting the Resistance Front, launched strike into Pakistan. Pakistan responded with strikes in India, and both armies in Pakistan and India kept opening fire and really moving closer and closer to the brink of open war, and a huge wave of chauvinism and national unity was unleashed in India and in Pakistan until the US brokered a ceasefire on May 10. And the ceasefire is quite fragile. These are two nuclear armed power. Chauvinism still runs really, really high, and the region is still on the brink. Is that more or less a correct summary of the events?
Yeah, I think that's the punchline. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it was a war. It broke out. But I think what was really absolutely shocking is how on both sides of the border, you had a huge rallying behind the Hindu chauvinist program of the Modi government. And in Pakistan, the really hated military and the current Sharif Bhutto government, they ended up gaining a lot of support as a result of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, we've just put out this article. It's called India, Pakistan, Still on the Brink, The Main Enemy is at Home. And I guess for me, the purpose of our discussion today is to really lay out, okay, there's a lot of there's a lot of nationalist fervor on both sides. I think the left, for more or less, is quite disoriented. And I think it's really, really necessary to have a clear understanding of what happened, i.e. what was actually driving this war on either side, and what was and what remains actually the task of revolutionaries in the subcontinent or in the diaspora. Because you know what, let's get real. This is not the end. This is going to break out sooner or later. As you said, the ceasefire is tenuous. Mm-hmm. So, we really need to take the lessons from this event to prepare ourselves for the next one. So what I want to do in our discussion today is lay out, what is a Marxist understanding of this war that broke out? And what does that mean in terms of the tasks of revolutionaries?
So you had, as I mentioned, a huge wave of chauvinism and national unity really rallying on both sides in Pakistan and in India behind the government. So can you lay out maybe briefly what was a Marxist approach to that entire conflict? Why did we choose the main enemy is at home as the main slogan we wanted to push?
I think that's a good question. Getting right into it. I mean, I think Marxism is nothing but concrete, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to understand, instead of just abstractions, you have to understand, okay, what are the forces driving this situation to a conflagration? So for us, the starting point really is that war is a continuation of politics by other means. So what is the politics behind this? So then we start looking at, okay, the interests of the ruling classes on either side. And the main argument we make is that neither side was fighting a just or a defensive war, right? Because that was really the argument on both sides. The Modi government, it was like, we're going to defend our citizens, our country from, escalation, aggression, terrorism, whatever, from Pakistan and Pakistan back to militias. So we're defending ourselves and our people. On Pakistan side, it was like, the regional hegemon has just attacked us. There was no proof. It was entirely unprovoked. So we are merely defending our country. And that really was the dominant narrative, top to bottom, from the government to the media to the left. Mm-hmm. So from our point of view, we say, look, neither India nor Pakistan was fighting a just or a defensive war. In fact, in India, the drive to war was simply a continuation of rabid Hindu chauvinism. And I'll get to what we mean by that in a second. And in Pakistan, it was really a continuation of the regime's policy of completely subordinating the country to imperialism, which, one of the grossest expressions of that is the repression of Imran Khan and his supporters, which is, there's a huge support for Imran Khan in the country. So these are really the two kind of forces on either side that were driving these national bourgeoisies, these completely wretched governments to war. right? And the war served both of their interests by really soothing, by tamping down the domestic discontent and whipping up hysteria against the external enemy across the border on either side. And therefore, it helped them to consolidate their own rule and to repress the masses, right? So that's how we approach what was at stake in this war. And of course, you can't even begin to talk about all of this without touching the whole question of Kashmir.
Yes, which we'll get to.
Right. I mean, this whole event that triggered this, it happened on the soil of Kashmir, and Kashmir, let's get one thing clear, is a oppressed nation, oppressed both by Hindu majority India as well as Pakistan, which is Muslim. But nonetheless, it is oppressed by these two countries, right? And both of them have, going back to partition, been at loggerheads with each other over the control of Kashmir, right? So you can't divorce that from the overall drive to war as well. So I guess that's kind of the summary view of what was at stake in this war and what was driving it.
It sort of set the stage a bit because I think you've made a good summary of the whole position. Now maybe we can get a little bit, in more of the specifics. And I think you really nailed it when you said war is the continuation of politics by other means. And although there are, many leftists out there who did oppose both India and Pakistan, and we'll get to the left a bit later, I think what's key for revolutionaries is really to seek to really intervene and counter and dismantle the arguments used for national unity, because it's real good to talk about solidarity in general across border, but you really need to get into what was driving so many people to rally to governments on both sides of the border, which were facing a lot of trouble domestically. And so this is what I'd like to do in terms of, so you mentioned already India, a war of continuation of Hindutva chauvinism. Can you explain a little more what was really the argument, the basis for national unity in India? Why were people supporting so much the government, and what sort of the response Marxists have to give to the specific Modi government, and maybe also its more left-wing cover by Congress and etc.
Okay. Yeah, good question. But actually, I left something out from the summary, which is, okay, there's the Marxist understanding of the war, but flowing from that, it's what are we trying to do? What is a revolutionary position on the war, right? And you touched on this already, but just I think at the outset, I want to state okay, what constitutes a revolutionary position on the war? If we've established that on either side, the war represented the interests of these two bourgeoisies, right? Then it follows from that the starting point is you need to oppose your own ruling class in either side. That means not backing the Indian government's war aims and not backing the Pakistan government's war aims, right? So that's first and foremost, hence, the main enemy is at home. And as you've said, really fighting to crack, to destroy this national unity, right? Because that is the glue that completely binds the masses, the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed to the programs of those in charge, the anti-Muslim, Hindu chauvinist Modi government. And what's really posed, I mean, the strategic question of the South Asian revolution, but also, concretely, it was to actually bridge the divisions that were being perpetrated between Pakistani and Indian workers, right? So to summarize, the tasks, the revolutionary position in the war was opposition to the ruling class in both countries, break with national unity, and to fight for the freedom of Kashmir, because both of these guys are going at it over Kashmir. But hey, guess what? It's oppressed. Kashmiris don't want to be in either country. Well, maybe it's a little bit more complex on the Pakistani side, but, fight for Kashmir, because that's actually a real basis to cut through the national unity as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
So, sorry, I missed that in my summary.
It's a nice...
Getting to the question of okay, India, right? India, we call it, in the article, we call it the war of Hindutva aggression. So I guess there's a couple of key arguments there. Is really the ultimate gaslight by the Indian government when they started talking about this is Pakistani escalation, all the briefings of the foreign affairs ministry, etc., external affairs. It was so suave and just insane that they just whipped this up as, this is escalation by Pakistan, no basis, no whatever. So they turned this attack in Pahalgam, which, I want to make very clear, this was an entirely indefensible act.
Yeah, they basically targeted Indian civilian and essentially massacred a bunch of them.
Yeah, and deliberately so, they're targeting Hindu people. That is utterly indefensible. We do not support those methods. But the Indian government took this, conjured up Pakistani escalation, and then basically shot missile strikes across the border, right? But so one of the arguments that we make is 22nd April cannot be the starting point to understand anything about this war. If you want to do that, then you're lost, right? You cannot make sense of any of this if you start with 22nd April in Pahalgam. And of course, I've just said, Kashmir really is at the heart of the rivalry between these two countries. They've fought multiple wars over Kashmir since independence. But, let's be concrete. So what has happened? One of the most significant things that Modi did in the last few years is that he scrapped Article 370. Right. So this was an article that used to grant special privileges to Kashmir.
And sort of partial autonomy in a certain sense.
Yeah, and some of our so-called revolutionaries might be like, oh, well, it was fake. Well, you know what? Yeah, it's not our perspective. It's not a revolutionary perspective. But it did grant Kashmir certain protections that, it's worse off.
Well, it does matter. Yeah.
It matters,
if you have these protections or not. Anyway.
If you're from an oppressed country, if you're from an oppressed place, you know that any protection you get matters, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the examples is now it's far easier for any Indian national, i.e. the billionaires, to go into Kashmir and start buying property, right? Previously, it was more difficult. So those kinds of things matter.
And if I'm correct, the resistant front, the group who carried this attack, was formed as a result of
precisely
this article being overturned, right?
Precisely. So the Modi government scrapped Article 370, and it was one of the key promises that Modi made in his second election campaign. That I'm going to unify India into some Hindu
crush Kashmir
nation.
Furthermore.
Right, exactly. So as you just said, the resistance front, it was formed consciously in response to this attack against Article 370. So one of the arguments we make is that no, the current escalation, the blame for it does not lie with Pakistan, as the government of India pushes. Actually, it lies with the Hindu chauvinist government's escalation of the oppression of Kashmir, right? And I think that is key to actually, one, getting the question straight.
Yeah.
And two, to being able to then start cutting through this national unity, we're protecting the country.
Because, India claims that Pakistan backed this resistant front, that it's all them, pulling the strings behind, and that, this front is basically killing Hindus. So it's a war to defend Hindus from Islamist Pakistan-backed people, want to just murder all Hindus. So that's basically what he's pushing, right?
Exactly. And we'll get to this a little bit with Pakistan and, the whole question of Islamist insurgencies and how that country plays into it. But I think when it comes to the complete lies peddled by the Modi government, the escalation, that the blame for that lies squarely at the foot of the Indian government, right? And that's, I think, one of the building blocks of countering the national unity propaganda. But I think if we look more fundamentally, how does this end up benefiting the Indian ruling class or the Indian government, right? Well, you whip up hysteria in opposition to something else, something outside, something over there, in order to consolidate support internally and tamp down on whatever contradictions are, threaten to get out of hand a little bit, right? If we just look at the track record of the Modi government, Modi's in his 11th year of power. So many analysts, observers, whatever, they thought that, he was going to get his supermajority. Guess what happened? He didn't.
Yeah, in the elections last year, right?
Yeah. And as a result, he's in a coalition government. And objectively, that means that he's a little bit more constrained in terms of what he can push, right? So on the domestic front, Modi didn't get his supermajority in the last elections, but more fundamentally, his whole Gujarat model, billionaire development, the Adanis and the Ambanis and all of that, guess what? There is huge levels of unemployment amongst youth, between, I believe, I might get the statistics wrong here, but it's in our article, between people age 18 to 24, 18 to 30, levels of unemployment reaching almost 40%.
Yeah.
And that is a pretty crazy situation given what that percentage means in terms of the overall, numbers, right? There's 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of people who don't have jobs, And yes, okay, the government loves to show like, oh, this is the number of toilets we built, the number of roads, blah, blah, blah. Okay,
yeah, gas
fine,
cylinder,
great.
I remember.
Yeah, fine. But, last time I was in India, I was speaking to people and I was trying to understand, okay, what do you think about, has there been development, etc. And, a very basic response is like, yeah, okay, fine. We got some roads, it's better than it was maybe 30 years ago, but you can't eat roads. I think you can't put it better than that. It's like, what is an ordinary person meant to do with all this quote development when there's mass youth unemployment?
Yeah.
A huge amount of the population depends on government handouts. So just basic, food grains or just cash handouts from the state. India is essentially a tinderbox. Right. So actually what's happening as a result of the whole Trump shaking up of the world order is that Modi is making quite a break with his previous strong man, I'm defending India, and he's fast tracking a bilateral trade deal with US imperialism. And concretely, that's going to mean slashing tariffs and handing the country on a platter to US imperialism. Right. And that could irk his nationalist base. So there's reasons why it was convenient and it was useful for the Indian government to whip up this hysteria and talk about, oh, we're just defending our people. In fact, we don't get into this, but Operation Sindoor. Sindoor is the name for, it's like vermilion. So married Hindu women, they put this red, powder on their head, I guess, to symbolize, that they're married. Right. It's just the whole optics of this thing. One of the faces of this whole event was the widow, and she was newlywed, and he was an army guy, and he died, and she became really this symbol of the whole operation. Except she sounded, fairly reasonable. She was like, I don't want war. But the government, they whipped this whole thing up to be like, we're defending women, we're defending the nation, we're defending everything. But let's get real. This served a purpose.
Yeah.
To stabilize themselves.
You wrote a really good article in the previous issue of Spartacist, number 69, The Fight Against Modi, What Next, where we really went in depth over the huge problems of development posed in India and the failure of the Modi model. I hope we can do an episode on this part in particular and really go into depth in this. So, but basically, Modi is in a quite shaky position, and the country is a tinderbox with massive need, and a war with Pakistan, directing that anger to the arch enemy on the other side of the border is quite useful at that time. And I wanted to make, just a parenthesis, this thing on terrorism, which looms so large in the politics of the Indian government, there's so much parallel with October 7, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah,
because the point we make is that you can't understand this whole war if you start with 22nd April in Pahalgam. And it's the same thing. You can't understand this war if you start with October 7, right? That's what all the Zionists are doing,
Exactly.
October 7.
These things they don't drop from the sky, they don't happen just randomly.
And October 7 did consisted in many ways of massacres of civilians, which are absolutely indefensible and wrong and counterproductive for the Palestinian cause. But you really brandish the Zionists, and even some people on the left sometimes really brandish this as a way to refuse to side with Palestine, essentially refuse to defend Palestine against the Israeli total genocide. And I feel that it's really the same dynamics. And one other thing that shocked me with this was that a lot of people in the Indian army or super chauvinist were saying, well, we need to apply to Kashmir Israel's playbook in Gaza. Really how Gaza has sort of opened the door to it's okay to just massacre an entire people. Anyway, these are the two parallels for me that I can see, and how Marxists must, or even leftists or anybody that wants to advance India, must resist this campaign around terrorism and really, as you say, I think, see through it and see how the central responsibility falls on the feet of actually the government and its oppression of Kashmir, which breeds constant resistance and including tactics which are absolutely wrong and counterproductive sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you raised that, because I think that parallel is actually quite hitting. It hits the kind of the main point. It's like, these are atrocious acts, but let's get something clear. There is an oppressed and an oppressor. Right. And the counterproductive methods that the oppressed, group is deploying, they're a sign of desperation. They're a sign of many things. We can talk about that. It's a sign of the betrayal of the left to actually fight and advance the cause of Kashmir liberation. It's the cause of the decades-long machinations of U.S. imperialism in the region that has totally bred Islamism. So there's lots of dynamics that give rise to that. fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that there's an oppressed and there's an oppressor, right? And that we have a side. We have a side with Kashmir.
And I think sometimes some Marxists are wondering, well, how do we combat Islamism? And really, and it is a problem, whether it's the Palestinian question or the Kashmiri question, communists are in competition politically with Islamic parties. And really, the only way you'll be able to undercut Islamism is if you can put forward a class struggle road for the liberation of Palestine or Kashmir. And that's really how, but we'll get to this in a few minutes, but that's certainly not what the Marxists in India, to my knowledge, have been doing, or most of them anyway.
Yeah, precisely.
Do you want to turn maybe to Pakistan? So we've sort of analyzed the politics behind the national unity in India. I think so I follow a lot of people on Twitter, which are pro-Palestinian people, and then I discover all of a sudden they all support the Pakistani government for some reason. And I think one of the tricky thing in their argumentation was that, well, India just bombed us for BS reason about saying we're behind this attack.
Yeah.
What do you want us to do? We're just responding to outright aggression from India. And I think this is where the justification for the war in Pakistan might be a little more tricky, I think, or might seem a little less openly, blatantly chauvinist. Maybe you can speak a bit to this?
Absolutely. I think definitely dealing with the Pakistani side is much trickier, but only if you see it as 22nd April happened and then now there's defense, and only if you kind of just float on the surface. But I do have to absolutely agree. All the Pakistani liberals, who hate the army because of just how wretched the army is, they all lined up behind the army because, we're defending the nation, they're defending the nation, and blah, blah, blah. So it was almost bizarre to watch that unfold. The social chauvinism on the left in Pakistan, new levels. You got socialists hailing the Pakistani Air Force for carrying out strikes. It was just absolutely bizarre. But again, so how do we, as Marxists, as materialists, understand what was at stake on the Pakistani side? And what was their side of the war like, right?
Why you shouldn't support it? Why was it not a progressive, even if it's a retaliation, whatever, why still you must oppose it?
Exactly. The subhead I use in the article is a war of national traitors. There's a need to root our understanding in the broader dynamics and interests of the Pakistani elite. So what's been happening in Pakistan in the last several years? Country is a complete basket case. Under the boot of the IMF, huge debt, cost of basic items, basic goods, medicine, what have you, soaring. The army is absolutely hated. And actually a really significant thing happened, which is that in opposition to the worsening state of the country and the hatred for the regime and the army and so on, you had former cricketer turned politician Imran Khan, who, came onto the stage, and he really was able to kind of harness the real discontent in the country in opposition to the regime. And he came to power, but we'll get into
to harness as well the anti-American sentiment by famously denouncing, the war on terror. He refused to denounce Russia or to, take the side with Ukraine during the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah. I think that was a huge reason for why there was support, because he called these questions, this long-standing servility to U.S. imperialism that really defines the state of the country, right? And as we write in another article, you can't understand the country without America, the army, and Allah, right?
Yeah, that's the three A's, right? That you need to rule Pakistan.
Yeah, the three A's. So you have Imran Khan, who was able to really tap into this sentiment and become really, really popular. And then he was thrown into jail, U.S. orchestrated coup, and he's currently rotting in jail. And at the same time, I think it was just a couple of months ago that you also had the BLA, the Baloch Liberation Army. Balochistan is an oppressed nation that's, divided, carved between Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. You have this increasingly insurgent Baloch separatist movement, and the BLA had captured this civilian train, and they had standoffs with the army. Pakistan is deeply unstable country these days, and it has been for some time.
And Imran Khan, just to say, the level of popularity, he's by far the most popular politician. And right now, who's ruling is the sort of the two historic dynasties, which are super discredited. They've sort of built a coalition just for the purpose of keeping him out of politics. And but essentially, his party, despite the fact that Imran Khan cannot run, despite the fact that a lot of the leaders of his party are banned, still wins a lot of vote throughout the country.
Exactly. Yeah,
Anyways,
exactly.
parenthesis.
Right. I mean, you just know that this is like the fact that Sharif and Bhutto, these two dynasties who hate each other, that they are in a lash up in opposition to this guy. You know that he poses some kind of a threat to the existing state of things. I don't mean to glorify Imran Khan. You know, there's lots of disagreements we have with Imran Khan, but you can't deny that this guy currently is incredibly popular. Mm. And the huge support for him, it can possibly like blow up, right? Mm. So if we understand a little bit of what's been happening in Pakistan the last number of years, and the fact that you cannot understand this outside of seeing Pakistan's subordination to US imperialism, right? Mm-hmm. I think one moment during this war that went really viral was the Pakistan Defense Minister, Khwaja Asif, who admitted to an interviewer on Sky News, we quote it here, and it's been quoted all over the place. You know, I think he says, we've been doing dirty work for the US going back 3 decades. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit shocking because he did it so casually. Yeah. And it was just such honesty that, of course, yes, this has been the case. It's going back to the Cold War and the anti-Soviet war drive by the US that these guys were really, really faithful lackeys of the US in nurturing these Islamist outfits. Mm. So that is a problem. Right. So the point we want to make is that these people, you know, the army generals, the Sharifs and the Bhuttos who have driven the country into the ground, all of a sudden they are puffing out their chests and saying, we're defending the country. Like that is a sick, sick joke. How can these guys claim to defend the country when it is entirely their whole perspective that has driven Pakistan into the ground, that is responsible for the current miserable state of Pakistani workers, of the Baloch, of the Sindhi farmers, of people in Gilgit-Baltistan, of Kashmir, you know?
And who've jailed the most popular politicians because the US asked that they do so, you know?
Exactly. So how can you look to these leaders and say they're defending our country? That is a sick, sick mockery of, you know, defending the country, right? And it's a very, like, once you start to approach it this way, then it becomes almost obvious that you shouldn't support these guys. Mm-hmm. Because the truth is, if you really want to defend Pakistan, it can only happen in opposition to these guys. You need to throw these guys out in order to defend Pakistan, right? Because guess what? There's another IMF deal around the corner. That's only going to make the situation worse.
Yeah, they're in negotiation right now for a new bailout,
Yeah, so, I mean, and the other component of that is when it comes to Kashmir, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir is called Azad Kashmir. Azad means free. So there's this whole illusion that, you know, going back to partition, Pakistan is officially called the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, right? So it was meant to be the kind of homeland for Muslims. So Pakistan really, you know, plays on the common religion, you know, majority of Kashmiris are Muslim. So it really plays on that to be like, oh, look, on our side, it's Azad Kashmir, it's free Kashmir. But on the Indian side, you know, they're under the boot of the Hindu chauvinist government, which is true. But let's get something real. Both of these guys carved up an oppressed nation and they both control it forcibly. Right. Mm-hmm. So having, you know, some term called Azad doesn't change the fact that it's oppressed. And again, if you really want to defend Pakistan, if you want to, you know, and what we mean by that concretely is defend Pakistani workers, right? If you want to do that, you need to really boot the Sharif Bhutto government out. You need to get rid of these generals and you need to champion the right of oppressed peoples, right? The Kashmiris, the oppressed minorities. Actually, the Shias, who've been one of the huge victims of the Islamist outfits, has been minorities within Pakistan. So the Shia minority, the Ahmadis, and so on. So it's a complete mockery to say, oh, well, India did an unprovoked attack, which yes, it did, but it does not follow that all of a sudden these traitors who've sold your country down the line, that they're all of a sudden going to defend the country.
Exactly. Because, particularly since these traitors are doing the same thing in Balochistan than the Indian army is doing in Kashmir, essentially.
Yeah, so it's really a sick joke. Mm-hmm. But again, I think this is really why it's important to have a clear-headed and a materialist understanding of what's at stake. To be able to cut through the hysteria on both sides, you need to take a step back and understand, okay, what's the starting point for Marxists? Okay, you start with the interests of the ruling class, and then you try and see, how is that playing out right now? How does this benefit the ruling classes on both sides? And you know what? Guess what? As a result of this entire episode, this regime, which has been despised ever since it came back into power after Imran Khan, approval ratings for these guys have gone up. And they've benefited. In fact, one of the things that they did as a result of this is that they have now allowed for civilians to be tried through military courts. So under the guise of defending the country, they are actually absolutely crushing ordinary people. And guess what? It's possible that this law will be used against Imran Khan.
Yeah.
Right. I noticed that when the situation really escalated, Imran Khan's party, they filed a petition in the Supreme Court asking for bail for Imran Khan because they were worried that the army would use that question to basically bomb the prison where he's in to get rid of him. Right. Gosh. So let's not get all confused about like defending the nation. Right. Who's in charge right now and what is their interest? And their interest right now is actively spitting on ordinary people and the oppressed. So if you really want to defend the country, you need to reject Pakistan's war drive. This is not a defensive war. It is a defense of the regime. Defense of the regime means defending the army. It means defending Sharif, defending Bhutto, defending the oppression of Kashmir, defending the repression of Imran Khan, defending all the crazy shit that's got Pakistan to this place. So, yeah.
I think that's a pretty good summary. War of national traitors.
Again, it is so urgent and necessary to counter that confusion and then just be like, oh, well, we're just being defensive.
In the article, you have a subhead called Two Prison Houses of Peoples. I mean, it's been throughout our conversation, more or less, how these two regimes oppress a bunch of different nationalities. I don't know if you can speak just a little bit briefly how that feels, that informs the war and the position of Marxists in it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we have touched on the question of Kashmir throughout, but I think the basic point, this is a bit of a broader point, it's that to really make sense of anything in the subcontinent at all, you have to understand that these quote nations, right? When these two governments go that, oh, we're defending our nation, right? The whole jingoism, the war drive that it
You're talking about India and Pakistan, like the
both.
nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Both of these, when they talk about defending their sovereignty, right, it means defending the existing borders. And those borders were carved out arbitrarily by British imperialism through the cooperation of Jinnah, through the cooperation of Nehru and the others. These are arbitrarily carved out borders that divided peoples, Bengal on one side, Punjab on the other side, Kashmir, that led to the bloodiest forced movement of peoples in human history, absolute communal massacres. This is what it means, right? That, quote, defending our nations, when India or Pakistan say this, they are defending their existing borders. And these existing borders, they forcibly retain many oppressed peoples, whether that's oppressed nationalities or religious groups, and that ordinary people have zero interest in the defense of these borders. If South Asia is to go forward, it will come in opposition to getting rid of these borders. I don't mean in some liberal way of like, oh, well, no borders, but in the sense of like, you need to really reunify the subcontinent on a revolutionary basis. And I think the reason for the two prison houses of peoples is that Kashmir is always a lightning rod that highlights this entire arbitrary character of these two.
So? Why Kashmir in particular?
Well, I think because, I'll just read out the sentence here, it's the clearest intersection of two rabid nationalist ideologies and regimes that need to defend the integrity of their borders in the interest of their self-preservation. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So, partition, it resulted in, quote, secular democratic India, which had all stripes of different peoples and religions and what have you within its borders, right? You got Sikhs, you got Tamils, you got Bengalis, you got Gujaratis, you got, Christians, and God knows, everybody in this giant prison house of peoples. I think after Tsarist Russia, India is the clearest example of this mess of so many diverse peoples within one country. On the other side, the entire basis of Pakistan is that we're the Muslim homeland. So for them, they think that Kashmir is rightfully theirs because it is majority Muslim. So you have these two competing ideologies where Pakistan says, no, Kashmir belongs to us because we're the Muslim homeland. But on the other side, India says, oh no, we're secular, we're democratic, we don't oppress again, based on any kind of thing. Yeah. We're all one harmonious peoples and the constitution is lovely and great and it defends everybody. But both of these ideologies conceal the fact that these are forcibly confined peoples within these borders.
And I presume that obviously that's hypothetical, but letting Kashmir go, for example, on its own or with Pakistan would open all these other questions and regions and nationalities who also are oppressed under the Indian state, right?
Yeah, I think it would really pose point blank, like so many other groups would start questioning, like, oh, wait, if they can do it, so can we. Why not?
Yeah.
And, you've got in recent years Sikh nationalists, the Khalistanis, who've been put in prison by Modi.
Yeah.
You've got, as I mentioned earlier, the Balochistan question. There's, in the northern provinces, there's Gilgit-Baltistan. We won't even talk about northeast India, right? Which is its own separate question. But I think the point is these countries, they have to really double down and triple down on Kashmir because it's so crucial to keeping the setup as it is. Because if they give a tiny, tiny inch, it stands to destabilize and open all these cans of worms that will call into question the entire basis. Why do we have this state like this?
And that's part of why it's so, a lot of people celebrated the ceasefire and everything. And okay, fine, ceasefire is better than all out war. But nothing has been solved. And as long as this post-colonial setup exists, and as long as you have these two ruling class there, who have, by the way, oversized military for almost the sole purpose of sticking it to the other side, As long as this entire setup stays, this conflict is bound to flare up again. And with the level of chauvinism that we just seen, it might very well be on an even higher level this time. And I would note also they both have nuclear weapons and, over 1.5 billion people live in this region. And it's like, anyway, just to underline the necessity that the only way to solve this country is if you tear up that entire post-colonial settlement and the ruling class which are defending it.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
The only way.
So as I motivated at the start, one of the key tenets for revolutionary position during this war was to call for freedom of Kashmir, to attack the integrity of these borders. That is a basis for national unity on both sides. But if you raise the question of Kashmir, neither government is going to be very happy about that,
Let's move to the left. So in our article, we sort of have a three categories of leftists on both sides. Social chauvinist, sort of pacifist, and then centrist. So I guess we'll explain a little bit what we mean by that. But if we start with the social chauvinist, and that's been quite viral, I think, at least on my Twitter, and I think if you're a leftist that follows the region, I'm sure you know about this, but it's been the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party of India Marxist quite openly siding with the Indian government. So can you speak of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't even know how to start. In a sense, these guys are so wretched that it's not surprising. But actually, it's new lows.
Yeah,
it is new lows because they've spent the last decade chanting about secularism and the Modi government and the Modi
fighting Modi,
blah,
saying
blah, blah.
Modi, Hindu chauvinism, blah blah blah,
Yeah. And
now,
they issue these wretched press releases, which is like, we back the precision strikes of Operation Sindoor, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, let's get real. This is had a specific purpose by the Modi government. It was to go after Pakistan. And again, I think you alluded to this earlier already. The whole glue of this national unity, of their whole support to Operation Sindoor was, the government's fighting quote terrorism. It's like, well, you know what? Concretely, they're doing it by launching strikes against Pakistan. So let's get that straight, right? So they said, quote, we extended support to the measures taken by the Union government aimed against the terrorists and their handlers. The Indian government should ensure that the unity of the people and the integrity of the country are protected. And again, from the fascist threat and so on, they're now talking about the Indian government ensuring the unity of the people and the integrity of the country, right? Let's not forget, India has millions and millions of Muslims who are the logical target of this hysterical war drive. So calling on the government to defend the country, which concretely means attacking Pakistan, all of these things is just new lows.
Crack down on the enemy within, i.e. Muslims.
Exactly. But I think a lot of young leftists were really disgusted by this. And it's very easy to be disgusted by this. This is pretty rotten. But I think what's important is to understand where this comes from. How is it that all of a sudden these two CPs have just backed the Modi government? And the point we make is that their class collaborationist program, concretely, of being in this electoral and political bloc with Congress for the last number of years in the India bloc, that their perspective is class collaboration. That means the program of the Indian bourgeoisie. So when things get hot, it brought them full circle to embracing the aims of the Hindutva government, the aims of the Indian ruling class. So that's where it comes from. So I think
class
that's really...
collaborationists, you refer really to they've been in a bloc with Congress, which is the other opposition party, which probably we won't get into in our next video. We can get more into Congress. They've been in this bloc for years and years and years in the anti-Modi coalition with a wing of the ruling class, which is also as rabidly anti-Kashmiri and anti-Pakistani. And so what you're saying is that this sort of bloc paved the way to really, just go directly to embrace Modi.
Exactly. And I think, again, we talked a little bit earlier about Kashmir and what breeds these movements in Kashmir. But a huge reason for that is the absolutely chauvinist position of the mainstream left in India, right? You cannot separate the Communist Party's social chauvinism that is supporting the Modi government from the fact that they are totally chauvinist on the question of Kashmir. In their own words, they called on the government to protect the integrity of the country. What does that mean? It means the oppression of Kashmir.
Yeah.
They refuse.
My God, I get it's so similar. You get a similar thing with the Palestine and Israel, because communism or Marxism had sometimes attraction in the Palestinian movement a little bit, but it was always a minority faction or proper, Marxist and class struggle perspective was never in command of the Palestinian liberation struggle. And it was always nationalism, and then it became Islamism. But in large part because Marxism was so discredited, like the Communist Party, Stalinist Communist Party supported the foundation of Israel and the Nakba. And the left in Israel has always been associated with Zionism, which means the oppression of Palestinians, and therefore a lot of Palestinian militants have turned away from Marxism as any sort of way forward, and thus embraced Islamism. And it's the same thing in Kashmir. You see really the same dynamic. How this support in the Modi government will only fuel really help Islamism to have credence among militants.
Yeah, absolutely. It totally maligns the name of communists for Kashmiri people. And the fundamental point is that you cannot separate the social chauvinism of the Stalinists from their refusal to call for self-determination for Kashmir, because that is the way that they actually concede to Hindu chauvinism. They cannot fight Modi. They cannot fight the Hindu chauvinism because fundamentally they are on a spectrum when it comes to the question of Kashmir. So you need to really fight for a break amongst the communist parties on this question of Kashmir, and why that's really key to reorienting the communist movement in India. Yeah. I mean, so these two parties were the most egregious.
Yeah.
But then you also had CPIML, Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation.
Yeah, Liberation is a bit different.
Yeah, they're a bit different. They're also a little bit, so in India, if you're a leftist, you'll probably, historically, I think they used to look to CPI, CPM. Last couple of decades, it's more Liberation. Like they're the less wretched party. So what Liberation did is, of course, it didn't openly support the war. And what they wrote was a call for de-escalation. But we argue that actually, despite not openly supporting the war and calling for, quote, de-escalation, that this is still a social chauvinist position. And why is that? Because social chauvinism means backing your government, right? Yeah. And in this case, what Liberation does is it totally backs the government's campaign against terrorism. That was the entire content of what it wrote during the war and what it continues to write. Like, don't fight the war, but hunt down these terrorists. It's like, well, what do you think? How do you think they're going to do that?
So you oppose the war, but you basically support the entire basis on which it is waged.
It is consciously confusionist. It is so confusing to somebody because our task is to cut through this national unity. And a huge basis of that is to go after the, quote, terrorists. So how are you going to call for de-escalation when you are peddling the same propaganda that is causing escalation, that has a huge majority of the Indian population in thrall, right? You can't. So, okay, fine, you didn't openly support the war, but you haven't broken with the government's position. You do not come out in opposition to the government. And that is a key line. The main enemy's at home. These guys, they're not saying the main enemy's at home. They're just saying like random soft blah, blah, blah to confuse people. So this is still social chauvinism because you need to be clearly in opposition to your own government, not backdoor peddle its own propaganda that is whipping up the hysteria. So to anybody who's listening, who's like, oh, the Liberation, we're cool, we're all right. No. Like, let's get that clear. That was just a social chauvinist. It's just a little bit more confusing to understand.
Yeah, it can become even more dangerous because it muddies everything, because they do oppose the war, but at the same time, they give a left cover to its political justification.
Exactly.
If we move to Pakistan briefly,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, who's in the social chauvinist camp there, or prominent at least?
I'm far less familiar with the Pakistani left than I am with the Indian left. So I don't know the whole breadth of the different groups and what they said. I think one group I do follow that has a little bit of traction is the Hukuk-e-Khalq Party. It's called the People's Rights Party. And actually, I found out today they're affiliated with this lash-up called the Progressive International, which I don't know if you know about it, but it's this lash-up of these third worldist Stalinist parties, in my understanding anyways. But so they've got this kind of a bit of a following. They're active. They're a real group on the ground, right? So they've got this general secretary, Amar Ali Jan. He's quite popular on Twitter if you're in the right kind of circles. But this guy, oh my God. I mean, not just this guy, I shouldn't make it all about him, but the perspective of this group was, it built up. It built up slowly, right? It's like, okay, well, this is crazy. India's doing this. But they openly backed the retaliation by Pakistan under the guise that we are just countering the fascist regime in India. Yeah. We are defending our legitimate sovereignty. And once the Pakistani army had actually retaliated, this guy tweeted love and respect for the officers of the Pakistani armed forces. And like my jaw hit the ground because I'm like, what self-respecting socialist would say this? Genuinely. It's a genuine question. For any Pakistani leftist listening right now, it was a genuine question. Please message. But it's just new levels. But like we said, we acknowledge that it was far more difficult to cut through the national unity in Pakistan. But if you have the correct approach, which is as a socialist, as a Marxist, you need to understand things from the point of view of competing class interests. So approaching it from the class interests of the Pakistani elites, well, no, this was not a war of national defense. It's not defense of Pakistani sovereignty. Hukuk-e-Khalq and Amar Ali Jan, this open love and support for the Air Force is honestly, it's supporting and defending the Pakistani regime, which is really to malign once again the name of socialists amongst ordinary people. And the point we made is that the true defense of ordinary Pakistanis must be premised on a struggle against imperialism, against the army, and against the government that have for decades sponsored and are responsible for the rise of Islamism.
And if we move to the pacifists, so obviously with in every war.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Because I was so infuriated when this was happening. So, this guy is like tweeting crazy stuff. And then the ceasefire is declared and the tone suddenly changes. And this is classic social chauvinism. The tone suddenly changes. And now that this is over, we must turn our attention back to the real issues and fight against poverty.
That's Amar Ali Jan, right? Yeah. As if the support to the government to the war did not completely undermine any sort of struggle that was going on against that hated regime. And as if you didn't help this regime revamp its image.
Exactly. So, I mean, the sheer hypocrisy. It's like, wait, we're going to put things on the pause right now. We're going to pause the class struggle. Yeah. We're going to pause everything. We're going to back the armed forces as they, quote, defend Pakistan. And now it's over. Okay, now we're going to go and fight poverty and blah, blah, blah. It's like, come on. This is just taking people for fools. This is honestly just so disgusting. So, but this is the same on the other side as well. It's like when things get tough, it's like, okay, we're just going to unify for a second. We're going to rally around the nation. But once that passes, then we remember all of a sudden, oh, there are struggles, there's poverty, there is oppression, and so on and so forth. You
mean that with the ceasefire, the openly really chauvinist rhetoric has sort of they've tried to hide it and came out with a bit more left wing facade.
I mean, on the Indian side, the GAL, so the CPI, CPM, Liberation, I think was in there, this other party, SUCI. These guys, they organized a march against the war after the ceasefire.
After the war was over.
Like, come on. After backing the program or the operation.
Just supporting the war.
Like, wait. Okay, now we must combat the war hysteria. This is not insulting workers and their intelligence. I don't know what is. It's just so utterly just hypocritical and disgusting. I think in the subcontinent, it's having, quote, communists and socialists like this that maligns the name and reputation of communists. Yeah.
Definitely. No, I just wanted to move briefly on the pacifism.
Yeah.
So there's been obviously a wave of pacifism, which comes with every war, of wanting, just a peace deal and the end of the conflict. And so is that prominent more in Pakistan or in India or in both? And what is the problem?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know to what extent it was prominent in one or the other country. But there's always a pacifist trend anytime there's war. And when it comes to ordinary people, that's understandable. They don't want their houses blown up and people dying and relatives dying and so on. But when it comes to leaders, when it comes to so-called socialism, to have a pacifist line, i.e. we're opposed to the war, we're for peace, etc., this is what Lenin called a swindle. It is spreading the illusion that you can solve the problems that repeatedly, time and time again, fuel wars, short of a revolutionary struggle against the ruling classes. So this is not our perspective. Lenin, his whole perspective during the World War, it was to use every crisis of the government to try and make a crisis for the ruling class. It was to use those moments to fight for a split in the revolutionary movement, to make it turn the war into a class war.
Exactly. Turn the national war into a civil war.
Exactly. But that's concrete, right? And we'll get to our class warriors in a second. But I think the pacifist left, it really ends up befuddling and confusing people, because there's a valid sentiment on the part of ordinary people. But as leaders, then it just means that, listen, if not today, 10 years later, two weeks later, whenever, this is going to fuel up again. So you cannot solve any of the oppression and the problems short of a revolutionary overthrow of the ruling classes.
I guess our issue is not so much because the basic impulse behind people who are pacifist or are attracted to pacifism is not wrong in many ways. They want an end to the war, and we certainly share this. And it is a sort of, I think Lenin called it the beginning of wisdom sometime for workers, to leave away from the blatant chauvinism and warmongering to this position. But it's really the problem of the pacifist camp is really to lull the masses into sleep with promises that a just solution to Kashmir or whatever question can be achieved in the current framework, with diplomacy and a bit of treaty and a bit of good faith on both sides, and really blinding people to the actual root cause of the conflict, and then thus how to solve it.
Yeah, it's ultimately just liberal. It's not socialist. It's not revolutionary. It's just absolutely liberal. And I really like the language you just used there to talk about Lenin. But there's this really great writing by Lenin called The Peace Program. It's from March 1916, so in the middle of the war. And I'll just say a little bit from that because we cited in this article. He says that which is the pacifist illusions of. It's like that's the very thing the bourgeoisie wants. It wants the workers diverted from the revolutionary struggle in wartime by means of hypocritical, idle, and non-committal phrases about peace. It wants them lulled and soothed by hopes of peace without annexations, democratic peace, etc., etc. And the task of socialists is to unmask this lie. Right? That you cannot have a just peace short of a revolutionary struggle. I think at bottom, this is the main point about why the pacifist left is a complete obstacle to advancing the interests of the working class in the war.
And then the third category maybe is maybe people who are not so familiar with Marxism or its term, it maybe might not know. Some centrist class warriors, that's what we call them, centrist essentially. And what are these? And if you can talk about the concrete example part that we focus on it.
Well, I think centrism is really when you start to get to the heart of the question as it's posed in the Marxist movement, right? What is centrist?
Revolutionary leadership, right?
Yeah. Revolutionary leadership, yeah. So what is centrist? It's to the uninitiated, it may be a complicated phenomenon, but all it means is really that you have all kinds of revolutionary left-sounding phrases and positions on paper, but you're not fighting for them in the concrete to take leadership on that basis, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that's simple enough?
I think, yeah, but even simpler is those who talk the talk but don't walk the walk, essentially.
Much simpler, yeah, exactly. Those are centrists. Like we just, a minute ago, we said, in revolution, the task is for revolutionaries to turn the war into a civil war, into a class war. Okay, good. So then, there are people like, some of the left, they were like, oh, war, but class war. Great. Let's do that. So how are you going to do that? Because all of a sudden Lenin says at some point that you're not going to have this moment one day where the workers are going to all line up on one side and the bourgeoisie is going to line up on the other side and they're going to go to war, right? There's a thing called bourgeois ideology. There's things called false consciousness. And, you have to prepare that class war. And that class war is prepared day in, day out through the concrete by showing in the course of events how the working class need to break from the bourgeoisie, how the workers should rely on their own strength, how in the concrete, well, in this case of this war, why they need to break with national unity, why they need to break from defense of Pakistan, why they need to break from, the fight against, quote, terrorism. All of these things. The only way to actually advance the class war is to fight in the concrete and to walk the talk. And that means centrally going up against the existing leaders and exposing them in front of the masses to win the leadership of the masses, right? That's the only way that you go from a centrist to a revolutionary. So some of the class warriors, it's like saying perfectly nice things that you cannot disagree with on paper. So I just have a couple of examples. So the Communist Party of Pakistan said, no Pakistan-India war, but class war. Okay, fine. Or reject the false nationalism. Okay, fine. We agree. But again, they don't provide any perspective to reject the false nationalism. Why should workers reject this? What's false about it? Why is it wrong? When you have these other socialists who are saying, no, defend Pakistan, right? So you're not giving ordinary people any tools with which to reject this. Similarly, as a really tiny group, Communist Ghadar Party of India, they said, this war is not in the interest of workers, peasants, and other working people of either country. Reject the chauvinist war hysteria.
Yeah,
fine.
Very good.
But you know what? Like that hysteria, that goes deep. And guess what? 2 other mass communist parties are whipping up that same hysteria. So how are you going to combat that? Why should workers reject this? It's not arming. It's not arming anybody. But I think the group I do want to talk about is the more interesting one. It's the Revolutionary Communist International.
Yes.
So that is the Grantite tendency in Pakistan. They have a group called the Inqilabi Communist Party. I follow them from afar, obviously, but they seem like they do a fair amount of activity on the ground. They have 100 people. This is not an immaterial thing. So the Pakistani section wrote a long analysis of the situation, lots of journalism and lots of analytical points that were, you can't really disagree with them. There's many correct points in there. The comrade who wrote this, Adam Pal, he talks about how the ruling classes are using this to shore up their own rule. Correct. We agree with that. We make the same point. They talk about how the Kashmir question is used. True. It's always used. Therefore, self-determination of Kashmir. So are we. Good. Although one thing they do miss out is the whole question of Imran Khan that is animating a huge proportion of the population. But we'll just put that to the side for now.
Just on this, I'll just quickly, you have to understand that the main question animating a lot of the masses is Imran Khan in this movement, and he's in prison. And I'm kind of amazed that he wrote this long piece trying to grapple with the domestic situation in Pakistan, and many things are correct, without mentioning once his name. And the RCI has been consistently avoiding this question. Anyway, that was my parenthesis.
I think that's a good and necessary parenthesis. I think we should come back to this another day.
Yes.
But I think, so come back to centrism. So they've said lots of correct things, like the Socialist Federation of South Asia. Who and what leftist doesn't want that? Great. Or for socialists, like, you can't solve these problems short of socialist revolution. Fine, let's go. What should I do? I'm an eager worker. I want to know what to do. Okay, what do they propose? So concretely, there's a general strike that's going to happen in India in 5 days' time on the 20th of May, right? India is on the Guinness Book of World Records for having the largest general strike in history. It looks pretty impressive. They can do this because guess what? It's 1.4 billion people, so there's plenty of people. But these are one-day things, and everybody comes out in their red flags and their red hats, and they go back to work. Right. But anyways, I don't mean to denounce the general strike, but I think the question is, there's politics. So what is the perspective of this general strike? Let's not forget, a lot of the trade union federations in India are dominated by, guess who? The CPs, right? In one way or another.
Who've just supported the war, and many of them.
Yeah. So Adam Pal is writing, okay, well, there's going to be a general strike. And then he says, and I quote, "This is a moment when the leadership of this strike could give a program of working class solidarity to end these wars forever and could launch a class war against Modi and his regime." End quote. Now, I mean, I don't even know what to say about this. Like, maybe I don't need to because I've been ranting about this for an hour now. But the leadership of this strike is entirely beholden to the national unity of the government. The leadership of this strike is pro-Operation Sindoor. Right? They are totally buying into the propaganda and pushing it and peddling it. So how could this leadership give a program of working class solidarity when their program, by whipping up national hysteria, is actually contributing to deepening the divisions between Pakistani workers and Indian workers? So how could this leadership provide a program of working class solidarity to end these wars when they are responsible for heightening the war hysteria and could launch a class war against the Modi regime when they have backed that regime? You know, so it's
I think
just,
it really gets to the essence of centrism, because, for those who might be a bit confused, they say all the right thing and then they turn around and fuel illusion in the existing leadership of that coming general strike, that how they can do something progressive. And it's really, this is always what centrism is. You say the right thing, but you don't fight for this program to be in command of the workers. Now, I think it's perfectly correct to want to use that general strike to break up that national unity, right? Which is still prevalent. You have to, right? But this can only happen if you put front and center denouncing the policy of the leadership of that general strike, whose support to the government will undermine the struggle of workers in countless other ways. It talks about political demands, but, well, which one? It would be good to add demands, but these demands would have to drive a wedge between the needs of the masses and the politics of the leadership of that general strike and their backing of Modi.
No, I think that's really well said, because when we do talk to members from this organization, one of the things that we often end up kind of debating over is that there's this understanding like, well, we're saying all the right things. Their members, they always say this, well, we're saying all the right things. What do you mean we're not revolutionary? And it's like, well, the point that we try to make, and this is really the essence of Leninism, and this is really what Trotsky fought for, is to fight for leadership in opposition to these existing traitors. And do that in the concrete, not leave the existing leadership in charge and just say your revolutionary phraseology in the abstract. Now, I'm already anticipating, because I know some of these people will listen, I'm already anticipating a counter argument where they're going to say, so a couple of days ago, they published, one of their British comrades published an article on the CPI and CPIM denouncing their social chauvinism. So they'll say, oh, look, we did go after the social chauvinists. Well, you did. Okay, good. I mean, let's ignore that your Pakistani comrade hailed a strike, but it's easy to go after the most egregious expressions, right? But there's a whole chain with these various links. You have the most right-wing expression, but then you have the little bit of the liberation type of expression, which is de-escalation. Then you've got like the more pacifist expressions. So to be a revolutionary, you really need to hit at the key point. You have to break with not just a social chauvinist, but any program that conciliates that social chauvinist, any program that refuses to take a clear stand in opposition to the government and actually fight for that, right? So it's not enough to just go after the CPI and CPIM. That's easy. No. Many liberals are doing this right now. So that's not revolutionary. That's just basic. That's doing your homework. You got to go after the more left-sounding ones and to really fight to split fight for a split within the workers' movement to get rid of these social chauvinists who remain there vis-a-vis the kind of the whole chain of pacifism. Yeah,
exactly. And that's the whole fight of Lenin against Kautsky, which was the most famous centrist. Yeah. And that's the thing with Kautsky, because it's easy to read now Lenin and, Kautsky, what a piece of shit, But if you go back in history, Kautsky was a respected Marxist. He knew his Marxism. He could talk very left. He was against World War I. He could criticize the most openly social chauvinist, Scheinman and everything. He could say that this was not good to support the war and blah, blah, blah. Yet he was keeping unity with these guys while having all this left-wing rhetoric. And that's why Lenin hammered so much on Kautsky, because he understood that the only way you'll be able to really break the national unity is if you really attack its most left-wing defender, in a sense, which was Kautsky. Now, I'm not saying the RCP is the same thing as Kautsky, but by only attacking the most right-wing element, making grand declaration about socialist revolution, and then fueling illusion that a general strike led by these social chauvinists could turn things around, is really playing, similar role, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the key lesson of Leninism. To fight for that split.
It was a bit similar with their position on Bangladesh, but we won't get into it. But they've had the same problem, their intervention in Bangladesh. A lot of really good thing. Basically, you agree with much, but the struggle really to put this perspective in command of the movement is totally blunted. Anyway,
absolutely. But I mean, there's lots to be said. But I think overall, what's the key point? You need to understand the war from the point of view of the interests of the ruling classes. and therefore of the interests of the working classes, right? They don't have anything to gain from this. They need to oppose the war of their bourgeoisies. You need to fight for freedom for Kashmir. And you need to really crack and break and destroy this national unity propaganda. And all of that stuff is necessary, but then to fight within the left, within the workers' movement, for that program, for that perspective to emerge as a leading perspective. Yeah. That's the basis to really take this forward, because as we acknowledge, that this is a tenuous ceasefire. This will emerge sooner or later again. India, Pakistan, it's a rivalry that's going back decades, and this is not going anywhere. And the only way to resolve this is through a real revolutionary perspective. So for any leftists who are wondering, okay, what really happened and so on, and to prepare for the next one, I think that's key. You need to understand what was at stake and what are the lessons to take forward and how to move forward and how to be prepared for the next time.
Well, I think we can conclude on this. Hopefully we'll have more episode about the subcontinent with you like this one. There's so much to be said, and we've written so much about it too right now. Well, you in particular. There's this article I mentioned earlier, The Fight Against Modi, What's Next? There's this article we just published, South Asian Powder Keg, which deals with Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, and 2 recent articles we've written particularly on the conflict. So go check it out at iclfi.org. Check us out on Twitter as well. Share this podcast if you like it. It really helps us when people share it. It gets the word around about it.
Yeah, I'll just plug myself. Sure. I'm particularly orienting myself to leftists in the subcontinent. If you hear this and if you hate what I've said, my handle on Instagram, Punjabi Bolshevik. You can also find me on Facebook, Mansa Kaur. Reach out. Let's have a debate. Let's have a discussion and thrash these things out. If you agree, spread it around, get in touch, and let's debate. What's the road forward? There's a lot more to be said, I'm sure. This is not by no means comprehensive. These are really complex countries and situations. But let's move forward in a way that's going to contribute to clarification. So I welcome all debates and proposals for whatever discussions and conversation. So at Punjabi Bolshevik on Instagram, Mansa Kaur, and follow us on X at Spartacist_ICL. And I think, obviously subscribe to the podcast as well.
Cool. All right. Well, see you next time.